what is direct method? The objection that has been made on GTM resulted in the introduction of direct method. Now, direct method was introduced in the 19th century, and the thing it seriously objected in GTM was translation. That's why they removed this very first thing. They claimed that target language should be taught in target language directly, without the intervention of any other language. That is why it is called direct method of language teaching. It is a reaction to the grammar translation method. In this method that was ignored in GTM, the focus was given to those things. For example, GTM ignored listening and speaking skills. They focus listening and speaking skills. GTM ignored the practice in teaching of grammar. They involved practice in teaching grammar. Direct method explained vocabulary items in the target language. There were memorization and reading skills, teacher reading, and here the teacher demonstrated things, start demonstrating things. So it was all opposite to GTM. Whatever the principles of GTM are, the opposite of those principles is direct method. In simple words, the method is based on the direct involvement of student in speaking and listening to the foreign language in commonly day-to-day situations. Consequently, there is lots of oral interaction, speaking skill interactions, spontaneous use of target language in the classroom, no translations are made, and little, if any, analysis of grammar rules, grammatical practices are given to the students. The focus of the lesson is on good pronunciation, good speaking skills. They introduce phonetic symbols to the students. They introduce teaching listening skills to the students. And they also introduce oral communication practices to the students. The philosophers and linguists who introduced direct method. Okay? There are some principles of this method. As we had principles of GTM, we have principles of this method. The first principle of this method is classroom interaction is conducted in the target language, whether it is questioning and answering between teacher and student, whether it is teaching or explaining the content of the subject, whatever the case is, the interaction takes place in the target language, the language that is taught to the student. Okay, this is the first principle. The second principle, concrete vocabulary is taught through pictures and objects, because the teacher here in this method is demonstrator. The third principle is the teacher is demonstrator. He shows things. He does not explain it through translations. So vocabulary is taught through pictures and objects and models and through associations with different things. Okay? Okay. The learners are not passive. They are actively involved in the classroom interactions. Then students are encouraged to think in the target language. They are motivated to not to convert and to not to translate to the mother tongue in their minds. You know, this is the normal condition with the GTM students. First they translate things in their mind and then they speak it and write it. Because they do not think in the target language, they think in the native language and then they convert their thinking into the target language. Here mistakes are allowed. They are tolerated. Why? Because when a student starts thinking in the target language, it is not his own language. he might be making mistakes. And direct method thinks that mistake is a learning step. When you do not make a mistake, how will you learn? Mistake shows that you are struggling to learn something. If you are not making mistake, it means you are not learning anything. Another principle is speaking is start first before reading and writing. So first there are listening activities, then that listening is enhances speaking skills, and then they start teaching reading skills, and then they listening, speaking, reading, writing. Okay? Another principle is there are lots of activities, real life communication activities in the classroom. Because without those activities, speaking cannot be taught. Real life language communication cannot be taught to the students. Okay? Another one is grammar is taught inductively. What is inductive and deductive technique? There are two major techniques of teaching. One is called inductive technique and the other is called deductive techniques. Deductive technique is a technique in which when you go from general to specific, while inductive technique is from specific to general. For example, in teaching of grammar, when you use inductive technique, so what will you do? You will teach them example and then you will come to the definition. In the deductive techniques in GTM, you first teach the definition and then you go to the examples. Okay? This is the major difference between these two. One is grammar is taught deductively in GTM. Grammar is taught inductively in GTM. Usually definitions are written and then they give examples. In direct method, the teacher might come to the class and he might ask, a boy should stand. So everybody will be looking at each other. And then he will say, Qasim, stand. So Qasim will stand. And then he will explain, do you know, when I say boy, you all were looking at each other. And when I said Qasim, only one person stood up. And then we'll say, why? Because Qasim is particular and boy is not particular. So one is common noun and the other. He comes to definition through examples and practices. Emphasis is given on the correct pronunciation and grammar. In this, pronunciation is solely ignored in GTM. Here, the teachers, they focus on pronunciation. Why? Because they focus on the oral communication of the students. The advantages of this method. Clearly, the direct method is a shift away from grammar translation method. You know this. It is a reaction to the grammar translation method. One of its positive points is that it promises to teach the language, not teaching about the language. GTM teaches you about the language, not the language. Direct method teaches you the language. You might not know what is noun, but you will be able to use noun in your speaking. In GTM, you will be knowing what is noun, but you will not be able to use it in your language. So it teaches the language, not about the language. Okay? Second, it is a natural method, I told you. It is just like the mother tongue acquisition, the first language acquisition process. First listening skills, then speaking skills, then reading skills, and then writing skills. So it is one of a great advantage of this method. Students, they easily go through this way because they have already gone through this way when they were kids and they were learning their first language. So they know this approach. Then There is no gap between active and passive vocabulary. There is no vocabulary, isolated vocabulary. Vocabulary is taught through demonstration and it is explained in sentences. It is not taught in isolation. It is not the case that you know a word in English for something and you do not know how to use it. Because in direct method they also teach you how to use it because they are explaining vocabulary item. There is no translation. For your understanding, they explain it. How do they explain it? They use it in the sentences. Direct method is based on the principle of education, and that principle of education is going from known to unknown. When they teach you what is common and proper noun, for example, when you do not know what is common and proper, it is unknown to you. So they start with what you know. With what? With boy and castle. As I told you the example. A boy should stand up and a castle. So you know boy and castle, and then they take you to the unknown, to the common noun and proper. The disadvantages. The first disadvantage is the philosophers and the linguists of the direct method, those who agree with this method, who follow this method, they believe that second language and target language and foreign language is learned the same way as the first language. And it is not the case. Because the situations and conditions in the learning of first language is different than the situations and conditions and the age of the individual learning the second language. Then second language is a determined process, whereas the learning of the first language is a natural process. One is artificial and the other is natural. You learn your first language from the environment naturally. No one teaches you. It is your wish, interest. You are in that language. You live in that language and you acquire it automatically. Second language, you do not live in second language because this is not the language of your society. You artificially create institutions and teachers and books and things like that. So it is altogether different, isn't it? Then it does not focus on teaching of grammar, and mainly the second language learners, they sometimes know how to speak that language, but they do not know the elements in that language, the essential parts and parcels in that language, the structure of that language. There are many words that cannot be interpreted directly in second language. So what is the strategy of direct method then? There are many words in the target language that cannot be demonstrated or explained in the target language, or you can explain it, but the student will be unable to understand it. Isn't it? So it is a disadvantage because the teacher then it takes much time to explain a single item. Otherwise, that very item can be explained in 1 second when you translate it. The method assumes that the auditory appeal is stronger than the visual appeal. Direct method, they believe that when we give them listening practices, when they give them listening input, they will speak it out. Some students, they are not auditory learners. They are visual learners. When they do not see things, they do not understand it. So it must have a capacity to target all types of learners. Okay? Then the method ignores systematic written work and extensive reading activities because the focus is on language teaching. This method that does not hold well in higher classes where the translation method is found more suitable. In large classes, this method is not applicable because you cannot give activities to all the students. You cannot focus on the oral skill of each and every student if there is a great strength in your classroom. So direct method and GTM both have its own advantages and disadvantages. Okay, thank you so much.